Imagine going into labor right now. No hospital, no doctor, no epidural, no monitor tracking your baby's heartbeat. Just you, on the ground, somewhere in the open wilderness, with only the people around you and whatever knowledge they carry in their heads. For nearly the entire history of our species, that wasn't a nightmare scenario. That was simply how every single human being was born. And here's something most people don't realize. Human childbirth is uniquely, brutally difficult compared to almost every other animal on the planet. This isn't an accident. It's the direct result of two things evolution gave us that don't fit well together. Walking upright on two legs, which narrowed the human pelvis for better balance and efficiency, and a massive brain, which means human babies are born with enormous heads relative to their body size. Scientists call this the obstetric dilemma, a narrow pelvis and a big-headed baby forced to work together every single time a human is born. Chimpanzees, our closest living relatives, give birth alone, quickly, and usually without complications. Human birth is slower, more painful, and historically far more dangerous, for one simple reason. The baby's head barely fits through the mother's pelvis, and it has to rotate on the way out just to make it through at all. This is why, unlike almost every other primate on Earth, human mothers throughout history rarely gave birth completely alone. They needed help. Researchers studying this pattern developed what's called the doula hypothesis, the idea that humans evolved to seek out companionship and physical assistance during birth because our anatomy made solo delivery so much riskier. Anthropologists have found that across nearly every traditional culture ever studied, women in labor were surrounded by other women, often mothers, sisters, or experienced elders who had given birth themselves and helped others do the same. These weren't formal doctors. They were something almost as important: living memory. Women who had personally witnessed dozens of births, who knew what a normal labor looked like, and who could recognize the early signs when something was going wrong. This knowledge wasn't written down anywhere. It lived entirely inside people's heads, and it was passed from woman to woman, generation after generation, through direct observation and hands-on experience. Birthing positions mattered enormously, and ancient women figured out something modern medicine only rediscovered fairly recently: lying flat on your back. The position still used in many hospital deliveries today is actually one of the worst positions for labor. It works against gravity and narrows the pelvic opening. Traditional birth attendants across cultures worldwide favored upright positions instead, squatting, kneeling, or crouching while holding onto a rope, a tree branch, or another person's shoulders. These positions used gravity to help the baby descend and allowed the pelvis to open slightly wider than it does lying down. Pain management existed too, just not in the form of medication. Across different regions, birth attendants used heated stones or warmed cloths pressed against the lower back and abdomen to ease muscle tension. Certain plants with mild analgesic or muscle-relaxing properties were chewed or brewed into teas, passed down through oral tradition as remedies specifically reserved for labor. Rhythmic breathing, chanting, and vocalization weren't just emotional support. Controlled breathing patterns can genuinely help manage pain and keep a laboring woman from panicking, which matters because panic and tension can actually slow labor down and make complications more likely. But even with help, birth was dangerous. Historians and anthropologists estimate that before modern medicine, maternal mortality was staggeringly high compared to today, and it's likely that for most of human history, a significant percentage of women who gave birth multiple times eventually died from complications related to childbirth at some point in their lives. Infant mortality was even higher. This wasn't because ancient people were careless. It was because certain complications, a baby positioned wrong, a placenta that wouldn't attach, uncontrolled bleeding, simply couldn't be fixed with the tools and knowledge available at the time. And this is exactly where experienced birth attendants proved their worth. They knew from watching birth after birth when to intervene. If a baby was breech, position feet or bottom first instead of head first, experienced attendants across many cultures knew specific techniques to attempt to turn the baby, methods that required real skill and were only learned by watching it done successfully and sometimes unsuccessfully many times before. If bleeding became severe after birth, some traditional birth attendants understood the value of immediate breastfeeding, or at least stimulating the nipple, because it triggers a hormonal response that helps the uterus contract and slow bleeding. This is remarkable because they had no understanding of hormones or physiology in any scientific sense. They understood it purely through observed cause and effect, passed down as practical knowledge. Do this, and bleeding tends to slow. Generations of trial and error had built an entire unwritten medical tradition. Cutting and tying the umbilical cord also required specific tools and technique. Sharpened stone flakes, shells, or later metal blades were used, and the cutting point and method varied by culture, but the underlying goal was universal: prevent infection and stop bleeding at the cord site. Some cultures used specific plant resins or ash with mild antiseptic properties on the wound. Another piece of knowledge discovered purely through observation of what worked and what didn't. Newborn care in the earliest hours mattered just as much as the birth itself. A newborn needed to be kept warm immediately since infants lose heat extremely fast, and hypothermia was a real danger, especially in colder climates. Babies were wrapped quickly in soft hides or cloth, and skin-to-skin contact with the mother, something modern hospitals now actively encourage, was almost certainly standard practice out of pure necessity, long before anyone understood why it worked. Breastfeeding began almost immediately, partly for nutrition, but also because early milk, what we now call colostrum, contains concentrated antibodies that give a newborn crucial early immune protection. Ancient mothers had no concept of antibodies, but they understood through generations of observation that babies who nursed early and often tended to survive at higher rates than those who didn't. Community support didn't end after the birth itself. In many traditional societies, new mothers were given a defined recovery period, sometimes lasting weeks, during which other women took over food preparation, childcare for older siblings, and daily tasks, allowing the new mother's body time to heal and her milk supply to fully establish. This wasn't considered a luxury. It was considered essential because a mother forced back into full physical labor too soon after birth faced serious risks to her own recovery and to her ability to properly care for the newborn. Twins and complicated births posed even greater challenges, and different cultures developed different responses based on available resources. In times of extreme scarcity, some historical and anthropological records suggest difficult decisions were sometimes made about which infants a community could support, a grim reality of survival in environments with limited food and resources. This wasn't cruelty. It was often the brutal math of a world without any safety net beyond the group itself. Despite all of this danger, humans didn't just survive childbirth. Populations grew, sometimes rapidly, across incredibly harsh environments, from Arctic tundra to scorching deserts. This happened because the knowledge kept improving. Every difficult birth, every complication survived or lost, added information to a collective, unwritten body of expertise held by the women who attended births generation after generation. A skilled traditional birth attendant in an ancient community wasn't just present for emotional support. She was, in every practical sense, the community's doctor, obstetrician, and emergency responder, all in one, carrying centuries of accumulated observation in her memory alone. And that tradition never actually disappeared. It evolved. Midwifery as a profession practiced across nearly every culture on Earth throughout history is a direct descendant of those first experienced women who sat beside laboring mothers in caves, huts, and open fields. Many of the practices modern medicine now recommends: upright birthing positions, immediate skin-to-skin contact, early breastfeeding, delayed cord clamping, are not new discoveries. They're rediscoveries of knowledge ancient women already understood through nothing more than careful observation and generations of hard-won experience. So the next time you think about how far medicine has come, remember this. Long before anyone understood anatomy, hormones, or infection, human survival already depended on an incredibly sophisticated, entirely oral tradition of childbirth knowledge, refined by women, for women, over hundreds of thousands of years. Every person alive today exists because that knowledge worked well enough, often enough, to keep the human species going, one impossibly difficult birth at a time.